Good morning, class. Good morning, students. This is Vivek Birda, your faculty and coach for the subject Business Environment from Tirthaka Mahavir University. I hope you are all doing well, and so far we have studied large number of things. We have covered about the business environment, about the business, about the global, about the various types of environment. Either it is macro environment, internal environment, external environment. Additionally, we have seen about the tools to study the environment, that is through the environmental scanning, environmental forecasting. We have seen about the PASL, PEST, and many more things. Then further onward, we have seen about the various types of environment. We have seen the economic environment, natural environment, technological environment. We have even seen about the political environment, demographic environment so far in our previous sessions. Then additionally, in our previous session, we have even seen about the labor, about the industrial policies, in which we have compared about the industrial policy prior 1991 and the new industrial policies, and the role of the role of privatization in the industries or into the economy. Then now today we are going to start up with a very important concept and important area of the business environment, that is the role of internationalization or the globalization and related content to this part. So we will be moving ahead in this side, and this is something which we are going to study. Thus, the global environment is something which is a very important topic when we compare about the business environment. So, what is global environment? Thus, it represents the ubiquitous liberalization which is resulting in the emergence of the borderless world for businesses. The last quarter of the 20th century witnessed sweeping political and economical changes. The privatization strategy hurled by the Margaret Thatcher, that is the former Prime Minister of the UK, significantly enhanced the pride of the place of the private enterprises in the developed economies. The economic changes ushered in the People's Republic of China in 1978 marked the beginning of the revolutionary changes in the economic policies in the communist world, which is by curbing the communism, socialism in the erstwhile USSR and the erstwhile bloc at the end of 1980s, which accelerated the pace of the borderless expansion of the business. Other developing countries too have substantially liberalized and reformed other economic regimes. Thus, the WTO, that is the World Trade Organization, is a profound environmental factor in the global business. Its principles and the agreement fosters, monitor, regulate the emerging borderless business world. Encouraged by the above factors, the cross-border investments have the pure surging and the MNCs have been growing substantially. This part presents a general picture in the factors and the Indian policy and the regulation of the international business and the financial transactions. Thus, moving ahead to this part, first we are going to cover the topic called GATT, then WTO, and then the global liberalization. So the following subtopics will be there about the GATT, the Uruguay round, then the silent features of the Uruguay agreement, then the GATT trip, then how to evaluate the Uruguay rounds, the evaluation of the WTO, the Doha declaration, the WTO and the developing countries, the WTO and the Indian and the India over there. So moving to the initial part, when we talk about the globalization, see, the global business environment is very significantly influenced by the global World Trade Organization, that is called WTO, and their principles and the agreement. They also affect the domestic environment. For example, India has had to substantially liberalize import, including almost complete removal of the quantitative import restrictions. The liberalization of the import implies that the domestic firms have to face an increasing competition from the foreign goods. The liberalization of foreign investments can result in growing competition from the local outputs of the MNCs. These liberalization, on the other hand, also provide new opportunities for the Indian firms as the foreign markets become more open for the exports and the investments. The liberalization also enables Indian firms to seek foreign equity participation in the foreign technology. This could help them to expand their business to improve the competitiveness. Further, the liberalization facilitates global sourcing of the Indian firms so that they can improve their competitiveness. Indian suppliers can benefit from global sourcing by foreign firms. Firms will have to be efficient, dynamic to survive the global competition. Inefficient firms may go out of the business. Thus, the consumers tend to benefit significantly from the word liberalization. The first topic in this area is GATT. GATT represents the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, that is GATT. The precedents of the WTO was born in 1948 as a result of the international desires to liberalize the trade. The Bretton Woods Conference of 1944, which had recommended the IMF and the World Bank, had also recommended the establishment of the International Trade Organization (ITO). Although the IMF and the World Bank were established in 1946, the ITO Charter was never ratified because of the objections that its enforcement provisions would interfere with the autonomy of domestic policy making. Instead, the GATT, which had been drawn up only as an interim agreement to fill the gap until the ITO Charter was ratified, became the framework of international trading system since it came into being in 1948. The international trading system since 1948 was, at least in the principle, guided by the rules and the procedures agreed to by the signatories to the GATT, which was an agreement signed by the contracting nations, which were admitted on the basis of their willingness to accept the GATT discipline. The GATT was transformed into the World Trade Organization with effect from January 1995. Thus, after about 5 decades, the original proposal for the International Trade Organization took shape as WTO. The WTO, which is more powerful body than the GATT, has an enlarged role than the GATT. India is one of the founder members of the IMF, World Bank, GATT, and also the WTO, that is World Trade Organization. The major objectives of the GATT are over as below. The preamble of the GATT mentioned as following main objectives. First, in raising the standard of the living. Second, in ensuring the full employment and the large and steadily growing volume of real income and the effective demand. Third, in developing the full use of the resources of the world. Fourth, in expansion of the production and the international trade. Next, the GATT embodied certain conventions and the general principles governing international trade among countries that adhered to the agreement. The rules of the conventions of the GATT required that any proposed change in the tariff and other type of commercial policies of a member country should not be undertaken without consultation of the other parties to the agreement. Thus, the countries that added to the GATT should work towards the reduction of the tariffs and other barriers for the international trade, which should be negotiated within the framework of the GATT. For the realization of the objectives, the GATT adopted the following principles. First, non-discrimination. The principle of non-discrimination requires that no member country shall discriminate between the members of the GATT in the conduct of the international trade. To ensure non-discrimination, the members of the GATT agreed to apply the principle of most favored nation (MFN) to all import and export duties. This means that each nation shall be treated as well as the most favored nation as far as the quantitative restrictions are permitted. They too are to be administered without favor. However, certain expectations to this principle are allowed. For instance, the GATT does not prohibit economic integration such as free trade areas or custom unions, provided the purpose of such integration and is to facilitate the trade between the constituent territories and not to raise barriers to the trade of other parties. The GATT also permits the members to adopt the members to the counter dumping the export subsidies. However, the application of such members shall be limited to the offending countries. Second is the prohibition of the quantitative restrictions. The GATT rules seek to prohibit quantitative restrictions as far as possible and limit the restrictions on the trade or to the less rigid tariffs. However, certain exceptions to this prohibition are granted to the countries confronted with the balance of payments difficulties and to the developing countries. Further, important restrictions were allowed to apply to the agricultural and to the fisheries products if domestic production or these articles are subject to the equally restrictive production or marketing controls. Thus, the consultation by providing a forum for counting consultations is sought to resolve the disagreements among the consultation. So far, 8 rounds of trade negotiations were held under the auspice of GATT, and each round took several years. the Uruguay round, the latest one, took more than 7 years to conclude, as against the originally contemplated more than 4 years. This shows that the complexity of the issues involved in the trade negotiations. An evaluation of the GATT, the growing acceptance of the GATT despite of the shortcoming is evidenced by the increase in the number of the signatories. When the GATT was signed in 1947, only 23 nations were the part of it, which has increased to 99 by the time of seventh round, and 117 countries participated in the next over there. That is the Uruguay round. In April 2008, there were 151 members, with several more countries formally seeking access to the WTO. The signatory countries account for around 90% of the international trade, indicating the potential of the WTO in bringing about an orderly development of the international trade. One of the principal achievements of the GATT was establishment of the forum for counting consultations. Disputes that might otherwise have caused counting and hard-feeling reprise, and even the diplomatic ruptures who had brought to the conference table and compromised. Thus, the GATT could achieve a considerable trade liberalization that were, of course, of the several exceptions. The agricultural trade was clearly an exception of the liberalization, far from being the freer trade in the agriculture, which became progressively more distorted by the support given to the farmers, which took the form of the severe barriers to import and subsidize to the exports in the traditional nations. Similarly, another exception was textile. Trade in the textile was restricted by multi-fiber arrangements (MFA). Under the MFA, import and textile items of the number of the developed countries were restricted by the quotas. Besides agriculture and textile, two exceptions of the general trade of the trade liberalization have been trade to the developing countries and the economic integration. Developing countries with the balance of payments problems have been generally exempted from the liberalization. Even the Uruguay round has granted such exemptions to the developing countries. Although the picture of the trade liberalization has to be qualified with such exemptions, the GATT achieved very commendable trade liberalization. The average level of the tariffs on manufactured product is in the individual countries was brought down from about 40% in 1947 to nearly 3% after the Uruguay round. Indeed, the period of 1950 to 73 is conspicuous by the splendid results of the progressive trade liberalization. In the 275 years since 1720, the period witnessed the highest average annual growth rates in the output and the international trade. These rates were substantially higher than for any other period. Indeed, the 1950s and 60s were described as the golden decades of the capitalism. The output level of the companies using newer and the new technologies in many cases were much larger than the domestic market would absorb. Expansion of the market to the other countries enabled even companies in other industries to increase their output. There was also a surge in the international investments. The progressive liberalization of the trade, however, suffered a setback since 1974, although the elimination of the tariff barriers continued. Even the developed countries have substantially increased the non-tariff barriers since then. The collapse of the Bretton Woods system in the early 1970s and the oil crisis made matters very difficult for many countries, both developing and the developed, and the result of these demands for the protection increased them dramatically. The developing country exported them have been hit very hard by the NBTs, as pointed out earlier in the chapter. Further, the export of the developing countries gained significantly less from the GATT rounds and did export of the industrial nations. The trade liberalization has been confined mostly to the goods of the interest of developed countries. In case of the agriculture commodities, not only was there no liberalization, but also there was an increase in the production. Manufactured products of the interest of developing countries like textile, clothing, footwear, etc., which have subject to the increasing non-tariff barriers. While the developed countries enjoy a more liberalized trading environment, the growing NTBs have been severely affecting the exports of the developing countries. Ironically, the developed countries are increasingly protectionism when the developing countries are liberalizing. This is indeed a sad commentary on the GATT and has a multilateral organization. Next is about the Uruguay round. The Uruguay round is a name by which the eighth round of the multilateral trade negotiations MTNs held under the auspice of the GATT, which is popularly known because of it was launched in the Punta del Este in Uruguay, a developing country, in September 1986. Because of the complexities of the issues involved and the conflicts of the interest among the participating countries, the Uruguay round could not be concluded in the December 19 as was originally scheduled. When the negotiations dragged on, the Arthur Duncan and the then Director General of the GATT presented a draft act convoying that he thought was the result of the Uruguay round. This came to be popularly known as the Dunkel draft. This was drafted by an enlarged and modified final text, which was approved by the delegations from the member countries of the GATT on 15th December 1993. Thus, the final act was signed by the ministers of 125th government on 15th April 1994. The results of the Uruguay round are to be implemented within 10 years since 1995. The different time periods were given for effecting the different agreements. The first round of the MTN concentrated almost exclusively on reducing the tariffs, while the seventh round, that is the Tokyo round held in 1973 to 79, moved on to the tackle non-tariff barriers (NTBs). The UR sought to broaden the scope of MTNs far wider by including the new areas such as trading service, the trade-related aspect of the intellectual properties, the trade-related investment measures. Because of the inclusions of these new aspects of the trade GATT negotiations, the developing countries have a very serious apprehensions about the outcome of the Uruguay round. The Uruguay round took up three basic subjects for discussion. First, by reducing the specific trade barriers and improving the market access. Second is by strengthening the GATT disciplines. Third is the problems of the liberalization of the trade in the service, the trade-related aspects of the intellectual property right, TRIPS, and the related investments measures, TRIMS. The most outstanding feature for the UR was inclusion of the subject in the third item referred to above in the MTNs of the GATT. The traditional concern of the GATT were limited to the international trade in goods. The UR went much beyond goods to service, technology, investment, and information. Some of the important features of the Uruguay round agreements are given below. The GATT and the WTO. Following the UR agreement, the GATT was converted from provisional agreement into the formal international organization called World Trade Organization (WTO) with effect from January 1, 1995. WTO also served as a single institutional framework encompassing the GATT and all the results of the Uruguay round. It is directed by the ministerial conference that will meet at least once every 2 years and on the regular basis, and is overseen by the General Council. The old GATT systems allowed, under what was known as the grandfather clause, existing domestic legislation to continue even if it is violated at a GATT agreement and a member country had accepted by a signatory to the GATT. The WTO especially rules this out. The situation after the coming into effect of WTO may be described as the GATT is dead, long live the GATT. Under the old system, there were two GATTs, the GATT, the agreement, that is the agreement between contracting parties, government setting up the rules for conducting international trade. Second is the GATT, the organization, that is the international organization created to facilitate discussions and the administration related to the agreement, that is the adopt through continued to exist under the establishment of the WTO. Thus, GATT, the organization, ceased to exist with the establishment of the WTO. GATT, the agreement, which has always been with or still does trade in the goods, continues to exist in amended form. As part of the WTO, alongside two new agreements, that is the General Agreement on the Trade in the Service GATTs and the General Agreement on the Trade-related aspects of the intellectual property right, TRIPS. The old text is now called as the GATT 1947 and the updated version is called as the GATT 1974. Thus, the GATT was ad hoc and provisional. WTO has its agreement and permanent. GATT has contracting parties. WTO has members. The GATT system allowed existing members' legislations to continue even if it is violated as a GATT agreement, whereas WTO does not permit this. The GATT was less powerful dispute settlement system was slow and less effective if ruling out could be easily blocked. WTO is more powerful than GATT. Dispute settlements mechanism is faster and more efficient. Very difficult to block the rulings. Thus, the functions. The WTO has following 5 specific functions. The WTO shall facilitate the implementation, administration, and operation and further the objectives of the multi-trade agreements and shall also provide the framework for the implementation, administration, and operational of the plurilateral trade agreements. Second, the WTO shall provide the forum for the negotiations among its members concerning their multilateral trade relations in matters dealt with under the agreement. The WTO shall administer the understanding of the rules and the procedures governing the settlement of the disputes. The WTO shall administer the trade review mechanism. Fifth, with a view of achieving the greater coherence in the global economic policy, making the WTO more cooperative, the appropriate with the IMF and IBRD and its affiliated agencies. Thus, the General Council will serve 4 main functions. First, to supervise on the regular basis, that is the operations of the revised agreements and the ministerial declarations relating to. Second, in which it includes the goods, services and the trips. Second is to act as a dispute settlement body. Third, to take a trade review mechanism. Fourth, to establish a good council, service council and the trips council as a subsidiary body. Thus, to become the member of the WTO, the country must completely accept the results of the Uruguay round. Thus, the silent features of the Uruguay round agreement. The liberalization of the trade in the manufacture was focused. The liberalization of the trade in the manufacture is sought to be achieved mostly by reduction of the tariffs and phasing out of the non-tariff barriers. Thus, the tariff barriers over there in the major liberalization in respect of the trade in the manufacturers regarding the tariffs were: first, expansion of the tariff bindings; second, reduction in the tariff rates; third, expansion of the duty-free access. Thus, the UR agreement envisages substantial tariff reduction in both industrial and the developing countries. The main liberalization by the industrial countries include expansion of the tariffs binding, that is the commitment not to exceed a particular level of the tariff to cover the 99% of the imports, the expansion of the duty-free taxes from 20 to 43% of the imports, and the reduction of the trade wage average tariffs by 40% from 6.2 to 3.7%. Second is, however, the gain of the developing countries from the tariffs curbed by industrial countries is less impressive. Thus, the reduction in the average tariffs on their export to the industrial market is 30%, and the labor-intensive manufacturers, textile, clothing, leather, goods, and other processed primary products, finished products, which are regarded as a sensitive, are below average tariff cuts. In industrial countries, the tariffs will be elevated in several sectors like steel, pharmaceuticals, and wood products. The developing countries agreed to bind their tariffs on 61% of their imports of the industrial products compared to 13% before the UR round. They also offered to reduce their trade-weighted average bound tariffs on the imports from industrial countries by 28% from 15% to 11%. The offer of the tariff reduction on the manufacture by the developing countries are estimated to amount to over a third of the world total. The expansion of the tariffs binding by the developing countries, which rule out further increase in the tariff, is regarded as a significant achievement. The India has bound tariffs at 40%, whereby they were above 40% in 1993 to 94 on the industrial raw materials, components, and the capital goods, and 25% in the other cases. After the UR agreements come into the force, about 68% of the Indian tariff lines will be bound compared to the 5% earlier. In comparison, many people of the developing countries in Asia and Latin or America have bound between 90 to 100% of their tariff lines at the level comparable to or lower than India's binding. The next point is the non-tariff barriers. In the area of the NTB, that is non-tariff barriers, the agreements to abolish the voluntary export restraints and to phase out the multi-fiber arrangements are regarded as a landmark achievement for the developing countries. The phasing out of the existing BERs within 4 years and the MFAs within 10 years would scale back the coverage of the NTBs on the developing countries. The trade from 18% of their 1992 exports
As trade in the restricted product line would tend to grow faster than the other trade, this coverage would fall to 4.2% by 2005. The UR agreement seeks to phase out the MFAs by 2005. According to some estimates, the phasing out of the MFAs could contribute about 20% of the total welfare from the UR. The largest gain will go to the MFAs importers who will be able to import basic clothing and textile from the more important suppliers in the Asia, China, South Asia, and the other regions by 2005. The total benefits of the European community, the US, Canada are estimated to be $56 billion per year at 1992 prices. However, the gain of over $13 billion are projected for the highly competitive exporters such as China, Indonesia, Thailand, South Asian exporters, despite of the loss of the quota rents provided under the MFA. Some less competitive exporters will suffer from loss of their potential access to the industrial country market unless they are able to increase their efficiency, and some currently unrestricted importers will lose the loss of exports with the currently diverted towards them by restrictions elsewhere and can flow freely of the other market. Thus, the liberalization of the agriculture trade. As mentioned earlier, one of the silent features of the UR was inclusion, or for the first time, the agriculture in the MTN, the exclusion of the agriculture from the previous rounds, and in the effective exemption from the GATT discipline made agriculture a highly protected sector in the developed countries. The depressing impact of this world price prevented efficient producers from realizing the benefit of their comparative advantage. Developing countries' exports suffered a lot. Thus, the important aspect of the UR agreement on the agriculture side includes the traffication, traffic binding, traffic cuts, reduction in the subsidies, and the domestic supply. Traffication and the traffic cuts. The traffication means the replacement of the existing non-traffic restrictions on the trade, such as import quotas, by such tariffs as would provide the substantially the same level of the production. For the first year of the agreement's implementation, nearly all broader production is to be bound by the tariffs, which in principle are to be no higher than the tariffs equivalent to the production levels prevailing in the base period. Thus, the industrial countries are then to reduce their tariffs binding by an average of 36% within 6 years from 1995, while all developing countries but the poorest are required to reduce the tariffs by an average of 24% over the period of 10 years. Least developed countries are not required to make any commitment for the reduction of the tariffs on the agriculture products. On agriculture tariffs, the developing countries have the flexibility of indicating the maximum ceiling binding. India has indicated the ceiling bindings of 100% on primary products and 300% on the edible oils. Thus, the subsidies and the domestic support policies. Your agreement deals with three categories of the subsidies. The first is the prohibited subsidies, all contingent upon export performance or the use of the domestic instead of the imported goods. Second is the actionable subsidies, those that have demonstrably adverse effect on other members countries. Third is the non-actionable subsidies, including those provided with the stimulated limitations. Third, non-actionable subsidy, including those provided with the stimulated limitations to the industrial researcher and the pro-competitive development activity to disadvantaged regions or to the existing facilities to adapt themselves to the new environmental requirements. Thus, the agreement also put restrictions on the use of the countervailing measures against the competitors' subsidies to prevent the undue hardships. Developing countries and the countries in the transition from centrally planned to the market economies are allowed with extra time to bring the subsidies into conformity with the new rule. While industrial economies are required to reduce over 6 years the volume of the subsidized agriculture exports or by at least 21% and the value of subsidies at least 36%, the figure respective for developing countries are 14% and 24%. All countries are bound not to introduce the new subsidies. Thus, the UR agreement has brought the domestic support policies also under the multilateral trade discipline. However, the domestic support measures that have also almost a minimal impact on the trade green box policies, such as general government services in the area of research, disease control, infrastructure, and the food security, and also the certain direct payments, such as certain income support policies, structure adjustment assistance payment under environmental programs, and the regional assistance programs are exempted. The non-exempted type of subsidies included in the aggregate measures of the support AMS required to be reduced include assistance in the form of production limiting subsidies and the assistance given for growth of the agriculture and the rural development, like procurement and support prices and subsidies on the inputs credit. However, even these subsidies are required to be reduced only if the total amount or as a portion of the value of the agricultural production exceed 5% in case of the developed countries and 10% in case of the developing countries. If the non-exempted subsidies are above these limits, they are required to be reduced by 20% in the case of developed countries and by 13.3% in the case of developing countries by year 1999. Thus, according to the Government of India, total AMS is negative without taking into the account of the exemptions available on the input subsidies to the low income and the resource poor farmers, and there are no reduction commitments. Nor does India have a minimum market access commitment in the agriculture. Thus, the UR agreement provides for the establishment of the minimum access tariffs quotas as reduced tariffs rates where the access is less than 3% of the domestic consumption. Thus, the minimum access tariffs quotas are to be expanded to 5% over the implementation period. Assistance for the food security, such as food subsidies under the public distribution system (PDS), will be exempted to the extent by which they confine to the poor. Non-agricultural export subsidies. Countries whose per capita income is less than 1,000 US dollars are not bound to phase out export subsidies. India's per capita income is 2,000 and was only $460. However, even such countries will have to phase out the export subsidy for the products where the share in the world export is 3.25% or more in the consecutive years. This is applicable to India in respect to the export of the diamonds. Next is GATT, the General Agreement on Trades and Service GATT, which extend multilateral rules and disciplines to the service is regarded as a landmark achievement of the UR, although it achieved only the little in terms of the immediate liberalization. Because of the spatial characteristics and the socio-economic and the political implications of certain services, they are being generally subject to the various types of national restrictions. Protective measures include visa requirements, investment regulations, restrictions on repatriation, marketing regulations, restrictions of the employment of the foreigners, compulsions to use the local facilities, etc. Heavily protected services in the different countries include banking and insurance, transportation, television, radio, film, and other forms of communication, and so on. Thus, the GATT defines services as a supply of the service from the territory of one member country into the territory of another member, in the territory of one member to the service consumer of another member, or by the service member of one member through the commercial presence in the territory of any other member, or by the service supplier of one member through the presence of the natural persons of the members in the territory of any other member. Thus, in short, the GATT covers 4 modes of international delivery of the services. First is the cross-border supply, that is called as the trans-border data flow transportation services. Second is the commercial presence, provisions of the services abroad through the FDIs or the representation offices. Third is the consumption abroad tourism. Fourth is the movement of the person, entry, and the temporary staff of the foreign consultations. Thus, while industrial countries have offered a market access commitment of some kind or over half, under 54% of their service activities, developing countries did so only less than 1/5, that is around 17% of their service categories. However, the tourism and the travel related services are the only activities in the substantial number of the developing countries made commitments. Thus, the framework of the GATT includes the basic obligation of all the members countries on the internationalization trade in the service, including financial services, telecommunication, transport, audiovisual, tourism, and professional services, as well as the movement of the workers. Although the obligations is the most favored nation, MFN obligation that essentially prevents countries from discriminating among the foreign suppliers of the services. Another obligation is transparency requirements, according to which each member country shall promptly publish all its relevant laws and regulations pertaining to the services, including international agreements pertaining to the trade in the services to which the member is signatory. Further, each member shall also respond promptly to all the requests for the specific information by any other member pertaining to any aspect of the services which are covered by the GATS. Each member shall also establish one or more inquiry points to provide the specific information to another member. However, no member needs to provide any confidential information and the disclosure of which would impede law enforcement or otherwise be contrary to the public interest or which would prejudice the legitimate commercial interest of the particular enterprise, public or private. Thus, the GATS lay down that increasing participation of the developing countries in the world trade shall be facilitated through the negotiated commitments or access of the technology, improvement in access to the distribution channels and the information network, and the liberalization of the market access in the sectors and the modes of the supply of the export interest to them. With reference to the domestic regulations, the agreements lay down that all measures of the general application affecting trade in the services are administered in the reasonable, objective, and impartial manner. There would be requirement that the parties establish way and means to the prompt reviews of administrative decisions relating to the supply of the services. It is recognized that the particular pressure on the balance of the payments of the members in the process of the economic development and economic transition may necessitate the use of the restriction to ensure the inter alia, that is the maintenance of the level of the finance reserves adequate for the implementation of its program for the economic development or the economic transitions. A member country may therefore apply restrictions on the international transfers and the payments for the current transactions and may certain circumstances advised under the GATT. If the event of the serious balancing of the payments and the external financial difficulties or threat thereof, a member has adopted to maintain our restrictions or the trade in services on which it has undertaken the specific commitments, including on the payments of the transfers for the transactions related to such commitments. The commitment of the members could countries under the GATT also include national treatment, that is to treat the foreign suppliers of services like domestic suppliers and provisions of the market access. The agreement on the trade in service also establishes the basis of progressive liberalization of the trade in services through the successive rounds of negotiation, which also applies to other agreements under the Finance Act. As stated earlier, the fear of the developing countries is that the liberalization of the trade in services will lead to the domination of the service sector of the developing countries by multinational of the industrialized countries. As a matter of fact, the trade in the service is already dominated by the developing countries. The developing countries are net importers of the services and their deficit has also been growing. Thus, the apprehension is that the liberalization of the trade in the services will be ensued the problems. Although many services are labor intensive and therefore the developing countries should be expected to have an advantage there have been several constraints in benefiting from this advantage. This includes the technical, organizational, financial, and legal. Moreover, immigration laws of the developed countries restrict the manpower flow from developing the developed countries. This severely limits the scope of the developing countries in benefiting from their comparative advantage. This may be noted that the industrial countries did not like to bring this kind of in the Urge round. Next topic is TRIMS. TRIMS represent the trade-related investment measures. TRIM, which is to certain conditions or the restriction imposed by the government in respect to the foreign investment in the country. Thus, the trims were widely empowered by developing countries. The agreement of the trims provide that no contracting party shall apply any trim which is inconsistent with the WTO articles. An illustrative list identifies the following trims as inconsistent. The local content requirement, that is, the certain amount of the local input shall be used in the products. The trade balancing requirement, that is, the import shall not exceed the certain portion of the exports. Third is the trade and the foreign exchange balancing requirement, and the fourth is the domestic sales requirement, that is, the company shall sell a certain portion of its output locally. Thus, the four, I am again repeating the trim, the list of which were identified under the trim are: first is the local content requirements, that is, certain amount of the local inputs should be used in the product. Second is the trade balancing requirement, that is, the import shall not exceed the certain portion of the exports. Third, the trade and the foreign exchange balancing requirements. Then last is the domestic sale requirement, that the company shall not set a certain portion of its output locally. Thus, the agreement requires the notification of the WTO inconsistent trims and the phasing out within 2, 5, 7-year plan by the industrial developing and the least developed countries respectively. Thus, the transition period can be extended for developing and the least developed countries if they face certain difficulties in eliminating the trims. Thus, next is TRIPS. One of the most controversial outcome of the war is the agreement on the trade-related aspect of intellectual property rights, including the trade in the commerce, trade in the counterfeit goods, that is TRIPS. The TRIPS could be TRIPS along with the trims and services are called as the new issue negotiated in the Uruguay round. Anti-dumping measures. The UR agreement provides a greater clarity and more clarification rules concerning the method of determining, thus the procedure to be followed in the anti-dumping investigations and the duration of the anti-dumping measures. It also clarifies the role of the dispute settlement panels and in conflict relating to the anti-dumping action may be national authorities. Thus, the product is regarded as dumped when you export to prices less than the normal pricing in the exporting country. Whereas whereas for the cost of production, because the reasonable amount of the administrative saving and every other cost and for the profits. Thus, the anti-dumping measures can be employed only if it is dumped. Imports are shown to cause serious damage to the domestic industry in the importing countries. Further anti-dumping measures are not allowed if the margin of the dumping, that is the price difference, is D minus defined as 2% of the export prices, or the volume of the dumped imports is negligible, less than 3% of the import of the products in the specification. Fourth is the safeguard action, that is import restrictions to import the domestic industry from the negative effect of the unforeseen important surge, that is the domestic industry is threatened with the serious injury. Thus, the UR agreement, however, prohibit the use of such actions where they constitute the grey area measures, including voluntary export restraints, orderly marketing arrangements, or other similar measures applied on either exports or imports. The existing grey area measures are to be phased out by 1999. Further, the agreement provides for the discipline on the use of all the safeguard measures, including the time limit requirements for the safeguard investigation and the non-discrimination generally among the sources of the supply. Thus, the safeguard measures would not be applicable to the developing countries where they share in the member countries' imports of the product concerned in relatively small. Evaluation of the Uruguay round. The Uruguay round was by far the most complex and controversial one. The fact is that it took more than 7 years to complete the negotiation, as well as originally contemplated more than 2 years, which indicate the complexities involved. It is inclusion of the new areas like trims services that attempts to liberalize agricultural trade and elimination of the NDPs like MFAs that increase the complexity of the negotiation. Thus, the success of the UR agreement will depend upon the spirit with which it is being translated. In practice, the traffication of trade barriers were acclaimed to be significant success of the UR. However, because of the way of the NTPs were converted into the tariffs, the so-called dirty to around 1% of the world GDP around, according to the GDP, the gain will be high as much as possible. Thus, the most of the gains will acquire to the developed countries. Some developing countries in the category of the least developed countries and net food importers are expected to lose because of the goodwill round package. According to some estimates, the increase in the real income will be roughly 1.6% of the GDP for the European Union, 0.2% of the US and 0.9% of the Japan. As a single country, the largest gain in the absolute term will accrue to the US between 2.8 to 6.7 billion, and it will be between 47 US dollar to 27 billion US dollar to 42 billion US dollars for Japan, between 61 billion to 98 billion US dollars for European Union, and between the 36 billion and this 78 billion for the developing country. 0.6% for South Africa and 0.3% for Brazil. Thus, the GATT has estimated that the world trade would increase by 12% on top of the normal growth rate, that is if the UR package is completely implemented. But in contrast to 1992, the US dollars, this represents the increase of the $745 billion. The value of the world exports, including the services, will be increased by around 10%. And the export of North Korea, North America,